Hey guys, tonight we slip through the red lacquered gates of the Forbidden City, quiet as breath, slow as candle wax, right into the world of men who were both nowhere and everywhere. You stand in the midnight hush of a Ming palace courtyard. It's summer, heavy with jasmine and smoke. Somewhere behind silk-draped windows, a woman sighs. Somewhere closer, you hear the ghost-light shuffle of slippers, not the confident clack of officials, but the soft, barely there footfall of someone who is not quite a man anymore. You turn your head. He's already gone. Welcome to the quiet empire of the eunuchs, where sexless men orchestrate the most forbidden romances. The kind of love stories that never make it into textbooks, stories whispered between incense and tears, threaded through corridors too narrow for sunlight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I always love seeing our little time zone family in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're already inside the city, past the gates the public never sees. No sound but the rustle of silk robes against gold-tiled floors. In front of you is the inner court, the private engine of the Ming Dynasty. 9,000 rooms, 3,000 concubines, one emperor. And floating like ghosts in the margins, eunuchs, the emperor's eyes, ears, hands. Castrated as boys, trained like courtiers, trusted more than generals. Or, at least, trusted to never impregnate it. Concubine. But history has a habit of writing its footnotes in semen and secrets. You walk past rows of crimson columns. Carved dragons curl around them like muscle. The Forbidden City is perfection by design, each corner symmetrically arranged. Every threshold guarded by lions and ritual. But you know perfection is a cover. Behind those perfect lines, chaos, boredom, isolation. Think of the women, chosen for beauty, locked in palaces, untouched except when summoned. Think of the emperor, drowning in flattery, isolated by power. And think of the eunuchs who glide between both worlds. Not family, not threat. Not lovers, except when they are in a world this tightly wound. Romance doesn't knock, it seeps. A hand brushing another during tea service. A gaze that lingers a second too long after dressing the empress. A poem left on a lacquer tray. The emperor may have had thousands of women, but the one he truly loved? Historians still argue whether she ever lay in his bed or spent her nights in quiet conversation with a eunuch who understood her better than anyone. You imagine it now. A silk screen between them. Her voice low, his even lower. No risk of scandal, no danger of heirs. But under that safety longing so thick it hurts to breathe. Eunuchs weren't allowed to marry, to father children, to claim love. But they weren't stones. And even if desire had been cut from them, affection wasn't. Neither was loneliness. Here's something they don't teach you in school. During the height of the Ming Dynasty, some concubines preferred eunuchs. Not for lust, though, that happened too, but for empathy. For attention. For the kind of slow-burning intimacy that the emperor, busy with governance or performance or other women, couldn't always give. One court memoir, scribbled in the sleeve of a discarded robe, tells of a eunuch who was allowed to sleep beside a concubine, not as a lover, officially, but as a comfort. Her personal shadow. She fed him sweet lotus paste from her fingers. He brushed her hair with hands gentler than a husband's. Their secret wasn't scandal, it was tenderness. That's the part most history misses. Now picture this. You're this eunuch. You wake before sunrise. You prepare her tea, wash her silk undergarments, light her incense, and comb her hair while she watches the sky change color. You are invisible, indispensable, and so close you can hear the shift of her breath when she dreams. And then you leave, because you must. Because what you want is irrelevant. Because you were cut for this. The Forbidden City is made of stone, but its stories are made of ache.o. And before we move on, here's a little fringe detail for your dreams tonight. Some eunuchs in China, particularly during the later Ming, preserved their removed genitals in jars, not out of morbid vanity, but in the hope that they might be buried with them, whole again in the afterlife. Imagine that, living your life in silent service, only to stash your future manhood on a shelf, next to the tea leaves and turtle shells. You'll hear more about those jars later. For now, you breathe in the scent of sandalwood and follow the flickering lantern light deeper into the inner court, because somewhere, someone is waiting behind a curtain. And not everything forbidden stays hidden. You follow the corridor deeper, past hushed shadows and into the chambers where bodies lie still but desire never does. Here's the contradiction you feel on your skin like humid air. Eunuchs, men made not men, moved in a world saturated with sex. They were stripped of their ability to reproduce, but never their ability to feel. Imagine being trained from adolescence to serve beauty, but never touch it. To stand 3 feet from the most pampered women in the empire, smell their jasmine oil, hear their laughter, and know your body had been chosen for its failure. Eunuchs were meant to be safe, not dangerous, not tempting, not men. But oh, history loves to get cheeky with intention. Because what emperors forgot is that control doesn't remove emotion. It just shoves it into quieter corners. In the hushed pillow talk of the palace, eunuchs often became the unexpected confidants, caretakers, and yes, sometimes secret partners. Unmanned they might be, but undone? Often. Let's get personal. One of the most scandalous love triangles, buried in Ming Dynasty silk, involves an imperial concubine, her eunuch servant, and a very jealous emperor. The woman, let's call her Lady Plum, because her real name was scrubbed from records, was stunning in that hyper-real, tragic way. Delicate wrists, pale skin, eyes like polished inkstones. She was favored for a while, then forgotten. And that's when she began confiding in her eunuch, a wiry man named Lin, whose voice was too soft and smile too sincere for palace politics. He brought her mango slices chilled on ice, read her verses from banned poets, and this detail historians still argue over danced for her in her private quarters during the monsoon months when the walls dripped with sweat. Some say they slept beside one another on a hot night when the emperor was away. Others say she once kissed him on the shoulder and said, "You're the only man here who sees me." Whatever the truth, it ended badly. Lin was reassigned. She was demoted. The walls closed in. And yet, for a moment, they found something unscripted in a place obsessed with ritual. That's the theme you keep brushing against like moth wings. In the dark, eunuchs lived in the intimate spaces of power, but were never allowed to claim it. Their sex lives, if they existed, were shaped entirely by contradiction. Some as historical. Gossip suggests developed techniques of pleasuring women without penetration, focusing on massage, on words, on long hours of emotional seduction. Others turn toward spiritual celibacy, redirecting desire into Buddhist meditation or artistic expression. And a few, if we're being honest, manipulated their safe status to get away with what full-bodied men couldn't. Yes, even within the clipped wings of castration, the human libido finds its loopholes. But there's another layer, one that sits heavy in the chest. Eunuchs didn't just serve women, they often became obsessed with them. Not always romantically, not always sexually, but emotionally. That specific kind of devotion that grows in the vacuum left by family, legacy, and the right to love freely. You tend to a woman's meals, moods, and medical complaints for years. You know her favorite dumpling filling, her migraines, the song that makes her cry. How could that not turn into something deeper? One eunuch diary, recovered centuries later and banned within weeks of its first printing, describes an aching. Prose how he once wept when his mistress married a visiting prince. "I was not jealous," he writes, "only disassembled." Let's break the tension with a tidbit, shall we? Did you know eunuchs were often the only people allowed to handle the emperor's undergarments? Not generals, not ministers, just the men with no manhood. Imagine folding royal silk underwear for a living while everyone else bows and recites poetry about virtue. Eunuchs held more access to the emperor's body than his own sons did. And yet, their own bodies were dismissed, downgraded, dismissed. As utility, it's a cosmic joke, really, a dark one. The empire relied on their reliability, their silence, their supposed lack of desire. But in the margins of journals, behind the curtain beds, in the blush of a concubine's smile you can see it. Wanting, blooming anyway. So now, as you drift through this velvet-wrapped world, ask yourself, what happens when someone is told their body doesn't matter? Often, they begin to find other ways to matter. Eunuchs learn to weaponize their silence, their invisibility, their proximity. And sometimes, they used it to slip into the deepest chambers of the human heart. The next time someone tells you eunuchs were just servants, remember, Lynn, remember. The mango slices, the poems, the dance during monsoon. And remember, history doesn't forget the quiet ones. It just whispers them until someone listens. You walk now through corridors that narrow the deeper you go, like you're moving not just through the palace, but through the layers of a secret. The walls here are painted with stories no one tells aloud, stories built on silence, on looks held half a second too long. The women of the inner court, the concubines, the empress, the overlooked attendants live in a world so curated it becomes surreal. Every movement rehearsed, every smile loaded. Imagine knowing your survival depends on whether you are chosen to warm an emperor's bed, yet also knowing that choice may never come. Days filled with embroidery, calligraphy, and waiting. So much waiting, but someone is always there, filling the silence. A eunuch, and not just as a servant, sometimes as something closer to a shadow, sometimes as something dangerously close. To a partner. You're seeing it now. These men weren't just furniture in the imperial drama. They were its most adaptable players. And in the lonely vacuum of palace life, they often became the closest thing to love. Think of it like emotional contraband. Officially, a eunuch's role was practical, to guard, to clean, to carry messages and prepare beds. But unofficially, they became mirrors. A woman could speak to a eunuch the way she never could with a rival concubine or a disinterested emperor. No consequences, no threat allegedly. And that, allegedly, is where things get interesting. There's a story, half legend, half suppressed record, about an empress childless, sharp-tongued, more feared than loved, who kept a eunuch as her private reader. His name is lost to us, but they say his voice could soften even her temper. He would read her poetry, philosophy, and court gossip disguised as fiction. And during those late-night readings, her hand would sometimes rest on his. They say she once told him, "You are the only man who listens without expecting." And that, in a place where everyone wanted something, his lack of wanting made him irresistible. Now pause and sit with that. Want can be exhausting. Being wanted, being reduced to beauty, fertility, or political leverage can become a prison. But being truly seen? That's oxygen. In a hothouse like the Forbidden City, eunuchs provided oxygen in places where everyone else was busy suffocating. Now, let's open a window into the physical side of things. You might wonder, if they were castrated, how did these eunuchs experience intimacy? Well, here's the twist: castration didn't mean uniformity. Some had partial procedures. Some retained more sensation than others. And more importantly, intimacy isn't always about sex in the traditional sense. Many eunuchs cultivated relationships that thrived on closeness, trust, and the eroticism of boundary breaking. Take, for example, the story found buried in the back pages of The Erotic Spirit Through History, where a concubine describes her eunuch as her sleeping garden. She writes, "He was not a man, but he knew my pain. He knew how to listen to my skin. And no, that's not metaphor. She means touch delicate, attentive, devout. He learned how to stroke her arms until her breathing slowed, how to place warm cloths on her neck when she cried from old memories. Not all passion requires fire. Sometimes it's steam. And here's the wild card detail for tonight. Some concubines wrote poetry about their eunuchs, but never signed them. Anonymous verses, hidden inside lacquer boxes, slipped behind palace scrolls. Fragments survive. One reads, "Your silence stirs me more than drums." Another simply says, "If I were not a woman, and you not so ruined, perhaps we would not have needed words." These are the artifacts of relationships history didn't know how to categorize. Not love, not lust, not platonic. Something hybrid. Something that only exists when all official doors are locked. And behind one of those doors, somewhere in the 1570s, a eunuch named Hao reportedly took his own life after the empress was poisoned by her rivals. He left a single hairpin beside his folded robe and a note that read, "She let me hold her hand when her heart was breaking." What more could a ghost ask for? Historians still argue whether stories like this are real or dramatized. But even if the names shift, the patterns are clear. Over and over, we find eunuchs serving as emotional anchors in a sea of ceremonial isolation. Not every interaction became a romance, but many carried the heat of what might have been. And that's where the real tension lies, not in scandal, but in almosts. You can almost smell the perfume, almost hear the whisper, almost touch what was never meant to be touched. You walk on past painted screens that never tell the full story, knowing that within these walls, it wasn't always the emperor who ruled the night. Sometimes it was the quiet hand that brushed a tear away, the low voice that read a forbidden poem, the man who was not quite a man, yet somehow more human than the rest. You enter a room that shouldn't exist. No doors, no guards, just a slit between two walls, thin enough to disappear when the torchlight moves. Inside, it's cool, quiet, and laced with something illicit. A paper fan lies open on a low table. Next to it, a pillow embroidered with plum blossoms and strangely a scroll with edges curled, like it's been read too many times. You unfold it. The characters bloom like water on silk. It's not a royal decree, it's a poem. And not just any poem, a verse about longing, with metaphors that dip into the sensual. "Your absence bruises the air I breathe," it says. Beneath it, a signature you don't recognize. And yet something about the tone, the ache restrained behind etiquette feels familiar. This isn't court poetry, it's confession. Someone risked everything to write this. And suddenly you realize you're not just in a palace anymore. You're in a diary that was never meant to be opened. Welcome to the space where official records stop and private longing begins. You've found the paper fan and the pillow book, the soft weapons of forbidden intimacy in a world obsessed with appearances. In the Ming Dynasty, erotic manuals circulated among the elite, disguised as health guides or moral instruction. They weren't illustrated with crude figures, but with elegant ink sketches, metaphors of plum trees in snow and cranes in flight. These books weren't pornographic, they were poetic, symbolic, and deeply coded. Eunuchs, paradoxically, were some of the most avid readers. Why? Because they lived in the margins, and the margins are where metaphors bloom. If you can't live it, you study it. If you can't touch it, you memorize how it should feel. That's how a certain eunuch name, lost to ash once, became a renowned intimacy advisor in the court. He couldn't perform, but he knew the theory. He'd whisper to concubines about timing, emotion, balance. He became their secret tutor in pleasures they were expected to master but never taught. One memoir recounts how a new concubine, barely 16, cried after her first imperial night. The eunuch assigned to her chambers brought her ginger tea and a pillow book. "Read it as poetry," he told her, "not as duty," and so she did. Historians still argue whether that was the Moment she began a lifelong emotional affair with the man who couldn't take her, but gave her back herself. Now picture this. Two people in a room. She lies on a chaise silk robe, falling just enough to reveal the hollow of her collarbone. He sits nearby, fanning her slowly. She reads aloud from a scroll about lovers who meet in dreams. He listens, eyes lowered. Nothing happens. Everything happens. That was the tempo of desire in the inner court. Slow, symbolic, absolutely unbearable. And eunuchs, precisely because they weren't allowed to act, became masters of implication. One even wrote his own erotic poems, not of conquest, but of admiration. "I never touched her," he wrote, "but she unfolded in my presence." That line alone survived the purge of 1644, scrawled on the inside of a lantern box. It's as if the Forbidden City itself tried to hold on to it. And here's a little-known fringe detail. Certain concubines kept small scent pouches filled not with perfume, but with snippets of poetry, often written by eunuchs. These were hidden under pillows or tucked into undergarments. One pouch, excavated in a 20th century dig, contained a verse so intimate it shocked even the researchers. "When I wash your robe, I weep not for the labor, but the closeness I will lose." That wasn't written by a courtier. It was written by a man who had no legacy but ink. That's what made eunuch romances so devastating. They left no heirs, only echoes. No tomb inscriptions, only footnotes and fragments. And yet, somehow they persist. Take a breath, because this next piece cuts deep. A eunuch named Zhao, known for his impeccable taste and calm demeanor, once served as emotional anchor to a high-ranking consort, exiled after a failed pregnancy. She was disgraced, confined to a cold western chamber. Zhao followed voluntarily. For years he stayed not out of duty, but devotion. He trimmed her candles, he read her fortunes, he made her laugh when no one else dared speak her name. And when she died, his hair turned white within a month. Officials noted it in the margins of a palace record, unsure what to make of it. Was it grief, or something they couldn't name? You decide. This was the truth under the brocade. Eunuchs were not blank slates. They were receptacles. They carried secrets, sorrows, and every whispered wish the palace tried to bury. They weren't allowed desire, so they became desire's archivists. That's why you now feel the air shift. The stories aren't just tales, they're palimpsests. Layers on layers. You can still smell sandalwood, but its finger now replaced by paper and ink and old tears. And as you fold the pillow book closed and slip the fan back into place, remember this: the most dangerous romance isn't the one that breaks the rules. It's the one that rewrites them, slowly, softly, until no one notices, until it's already over. You're moving now into the nerve center of the palace, where power doesn't roar, it hums beneath silk and ink and the rustle of documents shuffled in candlelight. This is where eunuchs ruled not on thrones, but from behind them. No swords, no bloodshed, just access. If the emperor's the sun, then the eunuchs are the shadows that stretch from him. You reach a room lined not with weapons, but with calendars. Long scrolls marked with names, times, stars, and small notations. Rain expected. Concubine 4th hall, request. Audience, dream troubling, consult monk. These notes aren't trivial, they are empire. Because in the Forbidden City, control of the schedule meant control of the emperor's body, his mind, his knights. And the men who held the brush? Eunuchs. You feel it now, the soft power, the terrifying elegance of bureaucracy. A eunuch could delay a rival's appointment by a single hour and derail an entire political alliance. He could grant a concubine an extra 3 minutes to whisper something strategic. He could accidentally misplace a message and keep a general waiting until his temper ruined his own cause. And all of this done with a bowed head, a polite smile, and a voice never raised above conversation. Here's a juicy contradiction. Eunuchs, neutered to prevent them from becoming threats, often became the most dangerous men in the court. Not through seduction, but through suggestion. They had no families, no legitimate heirs, and no clan loyalties, which made them perfect. Confidence. They could be bribed, yes, but more often, they simply listened. They absorbed. And then they moved the right pillow, dropped the right word, served the wrong tea. That's how you learn the most damning detail of tonight. The real lovers in the palace were often less powerful than the eunuchs who arranged their meetings. Eunuchs held the keys to the inner chambers, the maps of who slept where, who preferred incense or wine or silence. A eunuch once said to a visiting poet, "Love, here is a machine. I oil it." Not metaphor, job description. There's a scandal buried in the archives, involving an emperor's favorite concubine, and the elaborate charade required to get her into the emperor's bed, every third night massages, tea timing, music cues, moon phase calculations. All of it managed by her eunuch, who allegedly once swapped her with another woman to secure her rest. No one noticed, not even the emperor. And when the switch was discovered weeks later, guess who got promoted? Not the concubine, the eunuch, for loyalty, for creativity, for discretion. Historians still argue whether the eunuch orchestrated the whole thing for love, politics, or simply the pleasure of outplaying the game. Whatever the reason, he won. You find yourself now in a smaller room, lit by a single lamp. It's filled with maps. Not of land or war, but of relationships. Lines drawn in faded ink between names. Consort to empress, prince to tutor, eunuch to 4 different women, each line ending in a question mark. This isn't gossip, it's strategy. Eunuchs weren't passive. They were networkers, social cartographers. One of them, named Wei, famously engineered an entire year of bedchamber assignments to protect a concubine from political exile. She never knew. He never told her. But his records show it. Every reassigned evening, every falsified moon sign, every subtle redirection. Why? Maybe he loved her. Maybe he loved power. Maybe both. And here's the fringe tidbit for tonight. Some eunuchs developed their own coded hand signals, used only among themselves. They used them to communicate in front of nobles without being noticed. Flicks of the fan, taps of the sleeve, deliberate pacing patterns. One chronicler described watching 5 eunuchs have an entire conversation during a royal banquet without speaking once, like ballet meets espionage. Now imagine what that kind of coordination meant in the world of imperial romance. They could delay a rival's powder delivery, slip a poem into a robe, whisper false rumors to a jealous consort. The walls may have been made of stone, but information flowed like wine. And still, there's tenderness in this power. One eunuch, anonymous but brilliant, once wrote, "To serve is to know. To know is to ache." That line was found etched into a drawer beneath a broken inkstone in the Hall of Supreme Harmony. You don't write something like that unless you've seen things you weren't supposed to feel. The eunuchs lived in the cracks of empire, in the liminal spaces between love and duty, presence and absence. They were not merely footnotes. They were the authors of how things unfolded, page by careful page dot. So as you sit with this truth, surrounded by maps not of conquest but of connection, realize this: the most powerful touch in the Forbidden City didn't come from emperors or generals. It came from the hand that placed the letter, lit the lamp, opened the door at the exact right moment. The eunuch didn't need to sleep with anyone to change everything about who got to sleep with whom. In the empire of desire, logistics is king. You hear it before you see it, a soft rustle, the kind that lives between pages turning and secrets shifting. You're now inside the emperor's private wing. No gold, no crowds, just silence thick enough to feel. The eunuchs here walk lighter, speak softer. They're not just servants, they're gatekeepers to the most guarded man in the empire. But as you sit under a carved cedar beam, and watch one of them fold the emperor's robe with eerie precision. Something clicks. These aren't passive courtiers. They're the filters through which power flows, and every whisper that passes these doors either survives or disappears because of them. Now lean in, because here's the paradox wrapped in red silk. Eunuchs were both trusted and feared. They were given keys to the emperor's body, allowed to dress him, bathe him, manage his schedule, even sleep nearby in the event of emergencies. And yet, the very closeness that earned them this access also terrified the court. Because if a man, stripped of family, rank, and reproductive power, could earn the emperor's trust, what else could he quietly take? So they were watched closely, not just by ministers and empresses, but by each other. The Forbidden City became a paranoid terrarium, and the eunuchs were the most delicate and dangerous flora in it. And still, they thrived. Take the story of Sun Jing, a eunuch so favored he once handed the emperor his seal with bare hands, an act forbidden by protocol, but ignored that night, because the emperor was laughing. Sun Jing, they said, was funny, and that made him dangerous. He also read the emperor poetry when he couldn't sleep and rubbed sandalwood oil on his temples during migraines. They shared mangoes during the summer festival. But after Sun Jing was found with a sealed note addressed to the empress, he vanished. No trial, no farewell. The record simply says relocated. Historians still argue whether he was caught in a romantic triangle or simply stepped too far into the warmth of imperial affection. Either way, it burned him. And here's a stomach-turning detail. Many eunuchs were subject to surprise inspections, random body checks, strip searches, even recastrations in extreme cases to ensure purity. Some scholars debate whether these second mutilations were real or just threats, but accounts exist. That's how deep the fear ran, not just of treason, but of connection. Because the closer a eunuch got to the emperor, the more he blurred the sacred distance that was supposed to isolate the Son of Heaven. And in a world where distance equals reverence, intimacy becomes heresy. So eunuchs learned to disguise everything: affection, ambition, grief. They wore blank faces like armor. But sometimes, in the flicker of a candle or the curl of a smile, something slipped. There's a chilling tale of a eunuch named May who served the emperor for over 20 years. He knew his food allergies, his childhood nightmares, his favorite riddles. When the emperor fell ill, May never left his side. And when he died, May stood silently behind the curtain while the empress wept at the bedside. That night, May did something unthinkable. He cut a lock of the emperor's hair and sealed it in a scroll case. Not for treason, for memory. It was found months later during routine cleaning. The empress ordered his exile. No explanation. No protest, just gone. Because even mourning, when done by the wrong man, can look like possession. Here's the quirky fringe note for tonight. Eunuchs were sometimes used as royal decoys during travel. Dressed in the emperor's clothes, hidden in carriages, they served as body doubles to confuse assassins or rebels. So picture that. A man who isn't fully a man, dressed as the most powerful man in the world, parading through crowds while the real emperor dines in peace somewhere else. A metaphor so sharp it doesn't need unpacking. But back in the palace, the fear never stopped. Some emperors, especially the more paranoid ones, surrounded themselves entirely with eunuchs. No ministers, no generals. Just the voiceless, the loyal, the mutilated. One ruler, known for erratic behavior, reportedly had a eunuch hold his hand while he slept. Not out of desire, out of trust, out of fear. Eunuchs became emotional bodyguards, human comfort objects. And every time they gained that kind of intimacy, they stepped closer to danger, and yet many embraced it. Because even fear was preferable to invisibility. Better to be watched than ignored. Better to hold the emperor's secrets than be forgotten in the laundry lists of the court. They navigated a labyrinth of love and suspicion, devotion and surveillance. with the elegance of dancers and the precision of spies. And as you sit now, watching the eunuch quietly sweep the emperor's chamber, pausing only to adjust a pillow, with deliberate care you realize something haunting. In a palace full of wives, sons, ministers, and mistresses, it was often the eunuch who knew the emperor best. And that's the kind of knowledge that kingdoms are built on or destroyed by. The scent hits you first: jasmine, smoke, roasted duck, and something sweet like osmanthus wine gone warm. You've stepped into a feast, but not the kind with clinking goblets and poets reciting verses on command. This is quieter, private. A moon banquet held deep inside the inner court, lit by paper lanterns shaped like lotus blossoms and arranged so precisely it feels like you're inside a dream someone else planned. You sit cross-legged on silk cushions, and across from you, the emperor smiles, just slightly. On his left, a favored concubine plays the pipa. On his right, a eunuch pours wine with eyes lowered and hands steady. You might think you're witnessing a celebration, but if you look closer, you'll notice the real theater is between glances, the tension braided between gestures, and the lead actor might not even be the emperor. Because tonight, the one who set the mood, tuned the pipa, arranged the seating, and prepared the sweet lotus buns, was the eunuch. And that means the night belongs to him. In the Ming court, romantic rituals were carefully curated performances. Every gesture, every phrase, every pause was orchestrated with more precision than a kabuki play. Eunuchs were the stage managers of these seductions, sometimes invisible, sometimes starring in scenes they were never meant to enter. They chose the music, selected the perfumes, timed the wine just right to encourage a blush but not a scandal. And on certain nights, when the emperor grew tired of the usual fare or the politics of picking a partner became too thick with consequence, he'd turn to the eunuch and say, "You decide." That's power. That's risk. Because if you guide the emperor toward the wrong woman, you lose your neck. But if you guide him toward the right one, and she remembers who brought her there, you've just won a private empire of favors. It wasn't seduction. It was choreography. Now, there's one infamous evening that still haunts old records. The emperor, in a melancholic fog, requested a private dinner. Only his favorite concubine and one eunuch were invited. The eunuch, Liang, knew the emperor had lost interest in her lately. So instead of the usual fanfare, Liang arranged something intimate. No music, no jewels. Just steamed crab, jasmine wine, and the concubine dressed not in brocade, but in plain white muslin. A memory of her youth. It worked. The emperor, moved by nostalgia or loneliness, took her hand. But later that night, he called for Liang, not in anger, in gratitude. And here's where it gets murky. The next day, the concubine gave Liang a hair comb carved from sandalwood and wrapped in a silk handkerchief. Some say it was a thank you. Others whisper it was something else. After all, who knows what was said during the dinner prep? Who knows what look passed between the two when the emperor wasn't watching? Historians still argue whether eunuchs were ever true participants in these romantic rituals or merely facilitators. But one thing is clear. Without them, the seductions of the Forbidden City would have collapsed under their own weight. It takes finesse to create a fantasy. And eunuchs had plenty, plus an emotional intelligence honed by years of observing desire without acting on it. That makes a person dangerously perceptive, and sometimes painfully tender. Which brings us to the oddest twist of all. On some occasions, the eunuch was the fantasy. Yes, there were instances when concubines requested eunuchs for more than practical purposes. Not publicly, not formally. But notes slipped into sleeves, silk folded around gifts, songs sung with double meanings. One erotic manual even includes a coded chapter titled The Hollow Flame, which scholars believe refers to intimacy with eunuchs, emotional or otherwise. One passage reads, "He touches like rain, without thunder, without consequence, yet everything grows. You read that, and your breath catches. Because it means someone saw them, not just as intermediaries, but as men. Incomplete by design, but whole in presence. Tonight's fringe fact: some eunuchs were trained in erotic storytelling. They would recite tales to concubines during baths or bedtime. Stories full of longing and veiled metaphor. These weren't just entertainment, they were therapy. One concubine wrote in a surviving letter, he told me a story of a crane that waited for a mate who never returned. I wept for the crane, but I think he was speaking of me. The eunuch didn't touch her. He didn't need to. Words can be skin. You glance around the banquet again. The food is barely touched. The wine is warm. The emperor is distracted. But the eunuch? He notices. He adjusts the lighting, changes the music, rearranges the plates. And in doing so, he controls the atmosphere, the pacing, the outcome. The night bends around his choices. That's the secret everyone forgets. Sometimes, the person holding the fan has more influence than the man wearing the crown. You sip the last of the wine and hear the pipa end in a minor chord. And as the emperor yawns and rises, his robe catching a lantern's glow, the eunuch signals the servants with a flick of his fingers. The theater closes. But the story lingers, folded quietly in a comb, a song, a glance. Desire didn't always wear armor here. Sometimes it wore slippers and poured tea. The air is different here, thicker, like soup left too long on a flame. You're in the twilight chamber now, the place where emperors go when they're too sick to rule and too paranoid to die in peace. The eunuchs walk slower here, speak even less, because everything in this room matters. Every cough, every sigh, every glance. The emperor lies behind silk curtains, his breath shallow, his world reduced to whispers and shadows. And at his side, as always, is a eunuch, not a doctor, not a son, not a general. Just a man with no family name, no inheritance, and no biological stake in the future. Yet somehow in this moment, the most powerful person in the empire. You lean closer. The emperor says nothing, but his eyes dart toward the eunuch, who nods. Once. Not command, understanding. This is the final intimacy, not of sex or seduction, but of trust at the edge of mortality. This is where stories end or begin, depending on who survives to tell them. A dying emperor is a palace in crisis. The concubines pray, the princes position themselves, and the ministers hover like crows. But the eunuch? He already knows who's been sneaking which herbs into the tea. He's the one who saw the empress crying 3 days ago and the youngest prince slipping a note to the astrologer. He knows which consort the emperor last spoke to, which official brought poison wrapped in good intentions. And when the emperor finally closes his eyes for the last time, it's the eunuch who removes the robe, extinguishes the lantern, and carries the silence out like a final command. Let me tell you about a death that nearly changed everything. Emperor Jingtai, bedridden and hallucinating, whispered not for his sons, not for his wife, but for a eunuch named Yuan. He said, "Tell her I forgive her." No one knew who her was. Maybe a concubine, maybe a sister, maybe someone history chose not to name. Yuan never explained. He just nodded, wiped the emperor's brow, and left the room. The next morning, he burned a letter in the garden. We'll never know what it said. But we do know this. Within a week, the empress was stripped of her title, and a different concubine took her place. Coincidence? Historians still argue. But the record shows Zhoan was promoted to palace steward 2 days later. That's not a promotion. That's a thank you from beyond the grave. Death rituals in the Forbidden City were choreographed to the minute. Which color robe the emperor should wear, which belt to strike, who gets to cry, and who must remain silent. But behind the ceremonial choreography, there were decisions that didn't come from manuals, they came from the eunuchs. Which son is notified first? Which concubine is allowed one final goodbye? Who gets blamed? Who gets spared? That's not politics. That's personal. Because by the time an emperor dies, he's spent years, sometimes decades, talking to eunuchs. More than ministers. They know his fears, his regrets, his unfinished conversations. One eunuch even wrote in a hidden diary, "When he died, he held my hand, not for comfort, for memory." That's a line that could unravel dynasties. Now, for the scandalous twist. There was one case, shrouded in redacted scrolls and suspicious revisions, where a eunuch allegedly forged a deathbed edict. The emperor was fading. The court was split. And in that window of chaos, the eunuch wrote a decree naming a prince no one expected. That prince became emperor. And the eunuch? He vanished 2 months later under mysterious circumstances. No one proved it. But court poets started referring to him as the quill that changed the wind. If true, it means a man with no genitals, no bloodline, and no future manipulated the single most important succession in Chinese history. Think about that. He didn't rule from a throne. He ruled from a bedside. And here's your fringe detail. For the night, some eunuchs, in the final hours of their masters' lives, would sing lullabies. Not court music, not chants, childhood songs. The kind a mother might have sung before power replaced affection. One emperor, delirious and scared, begged his eunuch to sing the song of the green river and the carp. The eunuch did. Over and over, until the emperor stopped breathing. No one else in the palace even knew the melody. Where did he learn it? Who taught it to the emperor? Did they share a mother? A moment? Or was the eunuch simply the only one who remembered that before? Emperors ruled. They cried like anyone else? You leave the twilight chamber shaken. Not because someone died, but because someone stayed. That's the legacy eunuchs carved with ink and silence. They weren't just observers. They were the last face an emperor saw. The last voice he heard. And maybe, just maybe, the one person who knew him not as a god, or a ruler, or a legend, but as a man. The hallway is darker now. Not because the lanterns are dimmer, but because something has shifted in your chest. You've walked through the palace's private aches and public poses, and what waits ahead isn't a chamber or a courtyard, but a mirror. A legend carved from contradiction. You step through a lacquered screen and into the stories they don't. Print on porcelain or whisper over tea. The afterlives of eunuchs. Not the literal afterlife, though that too was a haunting thought for men, whose bodies were never buried whole, but their reputations, their mythologies. Because when the Ming Dynasty collapsed, the eunuchs didn't vanish. They transformed into folklore ghosts, saints, villains, martyrs. Men who never had a place at the table, but ended up etched into its underside. You see them in puppet plays as schemers, in old ballads as loyal companions, in scandal scrolls as the secret reason a dynasty fell. And sometimes, if you're lucky, in bedtime tales about a man in Dragonskyn slippers who outwitted fate with nothing but a fan and a secret. Eunuchs occupied a space the living didn't know how to categorize. They weren't fathers. They weren't monks. They weren't women or men or anything society had clear roles for. So when the empire fell, people filled in the gaps with whatever emotions stuck: fear, reverence, pity, rage. One legend speaks of a eunuch who disguised himself as a ghost to frighten corrupt officials into confessing. Another tells of a eunuch who wandered the countryside offering relationship advice to newlyweds, always insisting on 3 things: listen first, lie second, love third. And then there are darker tales of eunuchs who poisoned wells or cursed noble families from beyond the grave. These stories say more about the people telling them than men they're about. When you don't understand someone, you turn them into a symbol. And eunuchs, by design, were walking paradoxes. There's a real figure whose story morphed so many times that historians can't agree where fact ends and fiction swallows it whole. His name was Kiyu, Some say he was the last eunuch to serve under the Ming. Others insist he lived decades after, in disguise, offering insight to rebel leaders and fleeing concubines. One version has him dying penniless in a temple. Another paints him as a brocade-clad advisor to 3 rival warlords. The only consistent detail: his slippers Roganskin, embroidered with clouds. And the reason we remember them is because he allegedly left one behind every time he escaped danger. A breadcrumb trail of soft rebellion. Think of that image. Not a sword, not a banner, but a slipper deliberately abandoned, soft but damning. A final laugh from someone never allowed to laugh out loud. Now for your fringe gem of the night. In some rural villages, people used to carve tiny figurines of eunuchs out of sandalwood and place them under their pillows, not as charms, but as confidants. They believed the eunuch would carry their secrets into dreams and return in the morning with clarity. Not gods, not ancestors, just listeners. That's the legacy of these men. They didn't lead armies or sign treaties, but they remembered things. They carried feelings no one else could name, then passed them on in sighs, in stories, in sandalwood whispers. Historians still argue whether the romanticized image of the loyal, tragic eunuch is more fiction than fact. Was it a way for society to forgive itself for using and discarding them? Or were there truly men who navigated their mutilation, their marginalization, and still found ways to love, to serve, to matter? Either way, the stories endure. And sometimes they're all we have, because official records were often rewritten by those who feared eunuchs most. Pages torn out, names erased, roles minimized. But look between the lines, and they're everywhere. In the sudden shift of a queen's fortune, in the mysterious disappearance of a scandal, in the way some palaces were built with hidden corridors, wide enough for a slippered foot but not a minister's stride. You pause at a low shelf and pick up a fan. It's old, red silk, faded embroidery. You flip it open. There's writing, just a few characters. I was here. I heard everything. No signature, no threat, just a statement. You feel it in your chest, the weight of someone who stood behind curtains, beside beds, beneath thrones, and saw it all. Not to control it, just to remember. Because if no one else was allowed to care, they did that. So when you hear a story about a forbidden romance, a sudden power shift, a tragic fall, or a mysterious rise, pause. Ask yourself, who was in the room? Who held the pillow? Who poured the wine? Who folded the note that no one was supposed to read? There's a good chance it wasn't a general or a prince. It was someone quieter, someone patient, someone in Dragonskyn slippers, slipping through the margins with eyes wide open and nothing left to lose. The floor beneath your feet is polished to a mirror, but it's dusty in the corners where stories settle like ash. You're walking through a palace that no longer remembers its own name. The dynasty is gone, the throne's empty, the eunuchs once. So essential reduced to whispers, footnotes, or worse, punchlines. This is the aftermath. The red lacquer is peeling. The lotus ponds are choked with algae. Somewhere, a door creaks open, not because someone pushed it, but because time forgot to keep it shut. And in that doorway, you see a pair of old slippers. Abandoned, not royal, not ceremonial. Just soft, faded, and worn through at the heel. That's where the eunuchs are now, in the dust between empires, in the forgotten corners of memory, where love and labor were once offered and then deleted. When the Ming Dynasty fell, eunuchs became inconvenient ghosts. The new regimes didn't know what to do with them. Some were exiled, others forced into labor. A few, astonishingly, tried to reinvent themselves, opening tea houses, writing memoirs under fake names, vanishing into the back alleys of cities that had no use for men who didn't fit a category. They carried no lineage. They threatened no dynasties. They couldn't father sons or wield armies. But they remembered everything. that made them dangerous. So society responded the only way it knows how to when something doesn't fit. It mythologized, then erased. You find a story carved into a temple beam in Suzhou. No name, just a message. My service ended, but my hands still wake at dawn. The line isn't poetic, it's residual. Habit doesn't die when an empire does. Many eunuchs spent their final years waking before sunrise, preparing meals one would eat, folding robes they never wore. Not out of madness, out of muscle memory. You see, when your whole life has been sculpted around someone else's needs, freedom doesn't feel like liberation, it feels like an echo you don't know how to answer, but some tried. There's a report of a former eunuch named Ren, who ran a private school for girls in a village near Hangzhou. He taught them etiquette, poetry, and how to fold letters so the ink wouldn't smudge. He told them stories, not of emperors, but of women who survived the palace by being clever, quiet, or kind. His neighbors thought he was strange, but the girls called him Master Lotus. When he died, they planted a pond where his ashes were scattered. That pond still blooms once a year, and old women say you can feel someone watching, not cruelly, but protectively. Like someone who once spent a lifetime keeping secrets, now keeps one more, the memory of all that was tender in a brutal place. Tonight's fringe fact feels almost too delicate to be true. Some eunuchs requested to be buried with the silk handkerchiefs given to them by the women they served. Not rings, not titles, just a folded square of fabric, perfumed and embroidered with a name. One burial site unearthed in the 1980s revealed 3 such handkerchiefs, pressed into a lacquer box with a note written in almost illegible brushwork. If I meet her in the afterlife, may she know I waited. That's the kind of love history doesn't bother to record. The kind that left no heirs, but never stopped echoing. Historians still argue whether the eunuchs were symbols of power, tragedy, or survival, but that's missing the point. They were human. They were reshaped by an empire that needed their loyalty but feared their intimacy. And yet, many of them found ways to love, to serve, to shape destinies through quiet gestures and unseen sacrifices. Their stories aren't cautionary tales. They're mirrors reflecting what happens when society slices off what it doesn't understand and still expects devotion in return. You sit now on the steps of the abandoned court, listening to the wind tug through the empty colonnades. Somewhere, a screen rattles. Somewhere else, a single note of music plays from an unseen source. You could say this is where the story ends, but really, it's where you begin remembering it. Not the drama, not the betrayals, not even the romance, but the quiet. The way a man could exist beside power, beside beauty, beside longing, and still find meaning. And sometimes leave behind a slipper soft as grief. Now close your eyes, slow your breath. The night has carried you far. You've walked through silk-draped fantasies and beneath the burden of gold-tasseled secrets. You've seen how love can survive even when it's not allowed to speak. And you've touched the echo of men who gave everything to an empire that never quite knew what to make of them. So rest now in the quiet they left behind. Let the hush of the red walls settle over you like silk. Let the stories drift into your dreams, not loudly, not tragically, but like a whisper at your bedside. Just before sleep, don't let your body soften now, like a scroll left open to dry. Let the hush of the forbidden city settle on your skin red. Lacquer faded, jasmine smoke lingering, footsteps silenced. The stories have been told, but the echoes remain, soft as breath against a curtain. Imagine that quiet again, the space between longing and memory, between gesture and voice. Let your breath slow, deeper, longer, like the shadows in a courtyard no one visits anymore. The palace sleeps, so should you. Nothing more to see. Just a hallway of memories folding closed, one soft step at a time. Someone once whispered, "To serve is to know. To know is to ache." But you've listened. That's enough for tonight. Let go, drift, dream of Draganskin slippers and paper fans and the love that once bloomed in silence. End of script. Sweet dreams.